touch this.
Hello and welcome to the DAC Report, this time on the economy. I'm gonna read to you a little or not so little text that will kind of open your eyes, or so I hope. So let's start. Let's look at what will be the main problem facing the new president. American president, that is. George Bush came into office with the country already in recession. The recovery was fueled by mortgage equity withdrawals. Over 2% and sometimes over 3% of GDP growth in 2002 to 2006 was the result of rising housing prices, allowing consumers to borrow against their homes and spend on whatever they chose. George Bush would most likely have been a one-term president, as the economy would have been in a serious recession for 2 years, followed by a very slow recovery of less than a 1% growth in GDP in 2003-2004. Unemployment would have been dismally high. The slogan would have been, "It's the economy, stupid," all over again. But the nation was in fact growing at over 4%, and 9/11 was not so distant a memory. The focus was on a war on terror, and Bush won a close election. But that is not the situation today. The economy is in recession. Over 1 million jobs have been lost in the past 12 months. The preliminary number came out for the third quarter GDP, and it was down by 0.3%, the first negative quarter since the last recession. As it is the preliminary number and does not really have much data from September, it is likely that future revisions will see the number be even worse. 1% is not out of the question. The fourth quarter that we are in will again be negative, and even worse than the third quarter. Bush came in with a recession that started in the waning months of the Clinton administration, and he will leave his successor with a much deeper recession and a consumer that is on the ropes. In 2005, there was almost $595 billion in mortgage extractions that went into some kind of consumer spending. Remember, according to a graph that I have, that translated into a 3% rise in GDP. In 2007, mortgage equity withdrawals were down to $470 billion for a boost of 2% of GDP. The second quarter of 2008 saw an anemic $9.5 billion. At that run rate, we could see a drop-off of well over 90% from 2005. Now think what the second quarter would have been without the federal stimulus program of $150 billion. It might have looked and felt like this quarter. In the economic data which came out, consumer spending was down 3.1%. You have to go back to the intense and deep recession of 1980 to find a worse number. And we are just in the middle innings of what is likely to become a much worse recession. So did American consumers cut back on borrowing? Not if they had a credit card. Total loans from commercial banks to consumers grew by $89 billion for the 12 months ending in September. $61 billion of that was credit card debt, and the amount in recent weeks has exploded. Commercial banks' exposure via the total amount of credit card loans outstanding has risen more in the last 10 weeks than it did in the previous 10 months combined. Moreover, the growth in the last 10 weeks, 32.3 billion, or about 600 million per shopping day since the beginning of August, represents nominal growth of 9.3%, or plus 48.3% annualized over the last 10 weeks. What consumer spending there is has been fueled in part by credit card. The second largest merchant vendor for credit card use is now McDonald's. This suggests that many consumers are in serious distress when they need to get their $4 Big Mac and fries with a credit card. Note the rising levels of the duration of unemployment. It is now over 9 months, close to 38 weeks. As the recession deepens, this means a lot of people will stop receiving unemployment benefits. Oh, and of course, unemployment is not good for consumer spending. and it will put even more pressure on homeowners behind on their mortgages. And unemployed people do not pay taxes, widening the deficit. Happy times, happy times. So let's sum it up, will you? Will we? And this is what faces President Obama. Are you ready? The economy is in a recession that is getting worse by the day. This is the first consumer-led recession in 27 years. Unemployment is rising, and the time between jobs is probably over 10 months by the time he takes office. The U.S. deficit is likely to be soaring above $500 billion. Consumers are retrenching, hit by the double whammy of falling home prices and seriously lower stock values and retirement savings. You will not have the luck of George Bush to have consumers borrow $500 billion a year from their homes and resort to a negative savings rate. Banks will be cutting back on consumer lending, and consumers will be cutting back on spending and increasing their savings. The economy is unlikely to begin even a slow recovery until later in 2009, without serious and continuous large deficit-busting stimulus packages. Even then, the recovery is going to be prolonged, because the causes of the recession are the bursting of the twin bubbles of the housing and credit markets. These problems cannot be solved in a short amount of time. It will be several years into your administration before the housing market recovers, and the credit markets will be on life support for some time. The Fed has run up its balance sheet by over $1 trillion. Interest rates have been cut to less than 1%. There is no cavalry coming from the Fed to save the economy with more rate cuts. What are your options? You have made promises to various constituencies. One is a tax cut for 95% of Americans. The problem is that 47% of Americans do not pay taxes. So what you're really talking about is a massive expansion of welfare. But if you use the tax increase on the rich to pay for your tax cuts to other Americans, you have no money to pay for other programs, let alone get anywhere close to a balanced budget. And of course, as each year passes, there is less net Social Security income to the government. If you use your tax increase to fund more expenses today, you will not have that to fund Social Security in 2017 when the program goes into a cash flow deficit. Or taxes will really have to rise later in the decade, but then again, that will be another president's problem, won't it? How do you offer the increased medical programs you propose if you use the tax increase for tax cuts for 95% of Americans, read welfare for 50%, without really busting the budget, or any of the $600 billion in programs that you want to see? And your serious economic advisors are going to point out, at least in private, that raising taxes on the 5% of wealthiest Americans is eerily similar to what Herbert Hoover did in his administration, along with legislation to restrict free trade and increase tariffs, which you have also advocated. Look where that got him and the country. 75% of those rich you are targeting are actually small businesses that account for 50 to 75% of the net new job growth in the U.S. When you tax them, you limit their ability to grow their businesses. Further, you reduce their ability to consume at a time when consumer spending is already negative. Reduced consumer spending will be reducing corporate profits and thus corporate tax revenues, just when you need more revenues. A tax hike in 2010 of the magnitude you currently propose in a weak economy is almost guaranteed to create a double-dip recession. So this is what I have to say, and zip it. Happy time.